Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. As you know, more and more people are delaying marriage or not getting married at all. In the previous 100+ years, however, nearly everyone married. But was that always the best choice? In this episode, Mary Dahm returns for a fun conversation that looks at some people in history who shouldn't have married. You'll recognize most names, but at least one will be new. We end the episode by discussing some fun quotes about marriage also. By now, you know my normal request to rate and review and tell your friends and family. I'm also hosting some live Zoom events in the coming weeks and months. If you want to find out about them, sign up on the Solo Podcast page on petermcgraw.org. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Mary Dahm. Mary is a writer, English teacher, and previous guest from episode 19, Write Your Way Out. Welcome back, Mary.
Thank you.
So this episode came from an idea that we had. We were discussing how many female writers' potential careers were cut short by marriage. And it kind of came up with this sort of loose idea for a podcast about people who should not have married. People who have married but should not have done so.
But not all female writers. I think you'll be surprised by some of the people.
Yeah, it's not all female writers.
Mostly the first one.
But the idea was that there was a time where, because women, when they got married, they had to, take care of a home, raise children. They had to give up any aspirations they had. That's where this sort of got started. But then it sort of morphed into this idea that, as I like to say, I'm not anti-marriage. I just think it's overprescribed. That when most people do it, there has to be a subset of people who probably shouldn't be doing it. And I thought it would be fun to try to highlight some of those people through history who may have been better off remaining solo.
And it's all, it's subjective. These are my opinions. And if it's a person in history, all you have to go off of is their writings, their letters, the evidence you have from their lives based on other people.
So you did some research for this?
Well, one of the people is from one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. So I just know it really well. I didn't have to do much research. I just went back to sections of the book that I had already taken notes on. And then they were all sort of people I already knew, and I just did some additional research.
Okay, so let's all right, so the premise is these are people throughout history who may have been better off remaining solo.
Or I would say another interesting way to put it is if they were alive today, when being solo was more acceptable, that perhaps they would be solo.
They would not marry. They would not marry today, but sort of at their time, they didn't really have the choice to not marry. Yeah, I mean, that's, right? I think that's fair thing is like things, for example, podcasts didn't exist in the 18th century.
Yeah,
but
these are 19th century and 20th.
Okay, so podcasts didn't exist in the 19th century.
No.
But if they did, there wouldn't be one called Solo, the Single Person's Guide to a Remarkable Life.
No.
But now there can be.
But I mean, there were their version of, I would say the 19th century version of podcasts were lecture circuits. There's public intellectuals would go around oratory, right? They would do these kind of rail tours around the country. And so there was such a thing as public speech and people listening to that. And that's how people got new and progressive and interesting ideas. So like the anti-slavery movement emerged out of a lot of those lectures, like by Emerson. So people had access to new and interesting ideas that are now spread by podcast. So I wouldn't say it was the medium. It was the fact that just marriage was such a part of society.
Yeah,
there wasn't an alternate path.
There was no one on the lecture circuit
talking about this.
That's right. That's my point. Yeah.
No, although I would say slavery was a bigger problem. So I think that's good that they were talking about that instead.
Yes, I'm glad that one got tackled, so then we could open up some time for this one. Okay, so, and actually one of the people that I have on my potential list, I have a loose list. You have a real list.
I have a real list. You have a shit list.
Yes, I just wrote down a few ideas.
For context, I have a Word document that is color-coded and about 2,000 words long, and Pete has a yellow legal pad with like doctor's handwriting that I can't read.
That's exactly right. So why don't you start with your number? Is this your number one person?
This is my number one.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope I don't go on for too long. I'm very interested in this. So for a little context, this is from a book called Lincoln's Melancholy. Mostly, this is from that book by Joshua Wolfshank. And the premise of this book is it's more about mental illness than it is about marriage. It's the idea that Abraham Lincoln was not the president he was despite of his depression. He was the president he was because of his depression.
Okay.
That he was able to see things in a certain way and truly see accurately how bad the Civil War would be when other people were optimistic. So Abraham Lincoln there's a reason we remember him the way that we do. He really stood sort of outside of his time almost. He was such a free thinker. He almost seemed immune to the norms of the period that he lived in.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
So the premise of this book, not having read it, but knowing what I know about kind of depression, one of the things about depression is that that depressed people are often much more realistic in their thinking, that they don't have the natural optimism bias that a lot of people have.
Right. There's actually a term for that. It's called depressive realism.
Yes.
So this Shank's basic argument is an optimist is a good leader in times of peace. Mm-hmm. A pessimist is a good leader in times of crisis.
Yes. I've heard about this with like Churchill.
Right. Churchill was bipolar.
Yeah. So these kind of leaders who have some, sort of issues with mental illness sometimes can actually thrive in times of chaos.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't want to get off track, but
yeah, that's fine. So that's the premise of the book.
That's the premise of the book. And so this marriage thing is a relatively small part of it, but it just stood out to me. So to talk about this, we kind of have to talk about Lincoln's time. So talking about the fact that Lincoln was such a depressive, this was in sharp contrast to the idealized, sentimental, I would say sappy as fuck version of marriage at the time. Like people would do things like if their spouse died, they would put a lock of hair in a locket and wear it forever because they knew that they would be with them in the afterlife forever. So before that, pretty much through all of history, people had a much more practical view of marriage. Mm-hmm. Marriage was initially amongst like hunter-gatherer groups, it was just a way to divide labor and help people live more cooperatively and expand families so that you had in-laws. And it was good to have a lot of bigger families because society was so based on sharing. And then later it was a way to consolidate money and power especially for the rich. And then there was this huge, huge shift that is still influencing the way we view marriage today that happened in the late 1700s and then in the Victorian era, especially, which was like 1801 to, I forget the exact dates, but sort of really, I would say the 1830s through the end of the 19th century was when this shift happened where people began to marry for love more at higher rates and that people viewed their partner not to serve a practical purpose, but that they were emotional, spiritual, and financial partners. Mm-hmm. The idea of the soulmate essentially emerged during this time, right directly during the time of Abraham Lincoln's coming of age.
Okay.
So you can imagine this extremely negative, extremely gloomy, extremely pessimistic person. Mm-hmm. So Abraham Lincoln's generation, they were sort of coming of age during the 1830s, and that was right when this change started. So Lincoln's contemporaries described him as gloomy, extremely pessimistic. As a young man, he was actually suicidal, had a suicidal crisis. So somebody like that this idea of marriage as being this idealized, spiritually fulfilling, sort of transcendent state.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who's a depressive realist, that just didn't sit with him.
Okay, so wait, I want to make sure I understand this. So essentially, it sounds like what you're saying is that prior to this time, marriage was this sort of utilitarian function. You needed it in terms of survival. It had to do with, kind of families uniting in some way.
Yeah. Well, and the specific function it served varied widely throughout history, but all of them were pretty utilitarian.
Okay.
With hunter-gatherers, it was pretty much labor purposes. Later, it was to consolidate wealth, but it was always some sort of,
very practical kind of
function.
Thing. Okay.
Yes.
And then around this time, you started to have this idea of marrying for love and this idea of a soulmate, and that there's this very fulfilling element to marriage beyond the practical element. It's not that the practical elements went away.
Yeah,
but
it still existed, sure.
But they still, obviously, just like moving two people under one roof, saves money, for example.
But there just wasn't even that expectation before that somebody would marry for love.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also, maybe we get into this a little later, but it was, for most of history, it was very common to have mistresses. It was very common to have affairs.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't very taboo because there was not this expectation that you had to get everything, especially all of your sexual needs met from a marriage. So Victorian time, that was not acceptable.
I see. Okay, yeah. So I sense where you're going with this is Abe Lincoln, obviously famously married,
mm-hmm.
as all presidents have been.
Right.
Right. So
will we ever have a solo president? Probably not, but we don't have to get into that.
It's a good question. Well, I don't know. I think there's some chance that'll happen. I think there's a movie called The American President, and I think it is a solo president, and I think he's a widow.
Mm.
So
the only acceptable solo.
The only acceptable solo is a man who is widowed. Yes, that's right. So Lincoln got married.
He got married after, some amount of drama. He courted Mary Todd, and a courtship at that time, I would compare it sort of to maybe moving in with someone with the expectation that you would get married.
Mm-hmm.
There was such expectation behind it. So he courted her. He eventually broke off the courtship. That caused a lot of rumination and kind of stress for him. And then eventually they were reunited at a gathering of friends and they became engaged. And this is something that interests me. The person who engineered, it wasn't like an organic, they happened to meet. It was, you would think that maybe a mutual friend, maybe a family member brought them back together. But in fact, it was Lincoln's medical doctor who had been treating him for depression.
Okay.
With leeching and all the horrible treatments they had at the time that obviously don't work. He arranged the reunion because he was following the prominent physician's view at the time that marriage is a prescription for, he called Lincoln's condition hypochondriasis. But marriage is a healthy state of life, and it's actually a medical prescription used to cure basically anything. Like, you're struggling, get married, you'll feel better.
Oh, so some things haven't changed.
Some things haven't changed. So Lincoln had a lot of, it's not a reach to know that he didn't want to get married. We have in the historical record, he told a friend marrying her, quote, would just kill me. I thought that you would appreciate some of his reasoning.
Okay.
So this was something he told a close friend in a letter. And this is related to the fact that if you have a serious depressive episode, a mental illness episode, you sort of worry that you won't be able to trust yourself anymore, trust your decision making. So he was he prided himself on his wits and his decision making, and he wanted to have that strong. He kind of worried that another person in the picture would create difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, in that ability, his decision making, I once prided myself as the only, or at least the chief gem of my character. That gem I lost to the depression. How and when you too well know. I have not yet regained it, and until I do, I cannot trust myself in any matter of much importance. So this is a man trying to come back from this tragedy.
And at what stage in his career and his life was this? This was early on?
He had two major depressive episodes. The one where he was suicidal in the early 1830s, like 1832, 1834. He was in his 20s. He was, I think, starting to work in the legislature, but like local state legislature, not yet involved in national politics. That happened in the 1840s. So then his wedding, like my favorite part of this whole book is his description of this wedding. Lincoln dressing for his wedding, a boy who was just sort of a guest, asked him like, "Oh, where are you going?" Because he's wearing all his, like, I was about to say tux, well, like black and white, like formal wear. And Lincoln answered, "To hell, I suppose." And I didn't know you when I read it, but when I reread it, I said, "Sounds like Pete."
That's really funny. So, I mean, he's essentially in that moment admitting that he's not a good candidate to marry in general, or marry Mary Todd. That's her name?
Yeah. And she was, and you might argue, well, she was actually, what are the chances he marries another person with mental illness? She was likely bipolar.
I see.
But that's often not, those symptoms don't come up until a little later. Mm-hmm. So at the time he married her, she was a lovely woman, and he really liked her. I mean, everyone liked her. There wasn't something egregiously wrong with her. She was a good match. He didn't like the idea.
In part because he felt like having his individual perspective was so valuable for him. He didn't want that to get crowded out. He
was someone who valued rationality to the extreme, right? He's still known for this very measured decision making of going through every option and thinking very reasonably at a time when a lot of people were impassioned about causes. He was a very thoughtful thinker. So he was just he felt deep emotions because of his illness, but I just don't think he was always very reticent in letters to his wife. He never expressed much affection for her. Mm-hmm.
But the upside of him marrying in general is that it allowed him to become president.
Yes.
Right. So I don't know, I actually don't know that much about Lincoln. I had read a biography about him many, many, many years ago that I thought was quite good. But like one of the things that's striking about him is he unretired from politics to run for president. Mm-hmm. And that, and you can kind of imagine the counterfactual, the what if world. What if Abe Lincoln hadn't run for president? What would have happened to this country, during that sort of critical time? I think people agree he's one of the great presidents given.
Oh, absolutely.
Given what he did. So,
but that is a good point. Just quickly. Yeah. The idea that he needed to get married in his life to be able to become president. And also he did really love his children, even though he lost 2 of them and that was hard. But if he were, so it's not so much I guess for this one that he should not have gotten married, but I would say if he were alive today, perhaps he would be solo.
Yeah. He's not well suited for his personality.
Exactly.
He's not well suited for marriage.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great one.
And just quick plug.
Sure.
If any of this interested you, Lincoln's Melancholy by Joshua Wolf Shenk is the name. Shenk, Shenk. Okay. And I just love this book.
I'll put it in the exhibits. Super. All right. That's a good one. Can I ask you about one that I've been thinking about?
Is it Don Draper?
Well, I actually
we talked about that.
I have this idea of fiction. Let's digress for a moment, because I think that obviously it probably doesn't count to have a fictional character, come up in this, except I think that it's telling when there's a fictional character who shouldn't have gotten married. And so,
I agree.
So I actually don't think it's just Don Draper. I feel like it's almost every single character in Mad Men.
In Mad Men?
So think about through the list, right?
Probably.
All the major characters have profound problems with their marriages, right? So obviously,
now I'm trying to think of one who doesn't. I guess. Well, Pete and Trudy end up happy in the end, but
yeah, right. But I mean, he had to move out at one point, right? Because he was having an extramarital affair, and she caught him there. And he also never really embraced moving out into the suburbs.
It's true.
He wanted to remain in New York City. He resented that.
I don't know if we should go too much into Mad Men. If people haven't seen it, it's
That's
probably
fair.
not the most interesting example.
But the point is, the lead character, Don Draper, is married multiple times, and it ends in tears every
Right.
time.
And known as Don, especially known as this womanizer. He's constantly at the office. He can't stop trying to escape from his life and having all these affairs, right? And completely kind of the archetype of the stoic, silent type, but the emotionally unavailable father.
Yes.
So what interests me with that is that a person like that, whether or not they want to have kids, they probably should not have kids.
Yes.
They're not suited to being a parent. But he had to have a wife. He had to have kids for a similar reason to Lincoln. To work in advertising, you got to look like a family man.
Yes.
Right. You have to subscribe to certain values so you can go to the golf course and chat about the wives and do the thing. So there's a lot of careers like this. Which is interesting. Is one pressure to get marriage can actually to get married can come from your career path and the culture of that world.
Yes, that's right. Even though it really doesn't have much to do with your ability to be good at your job.
No, it doesn't. It's just culture.
It's just socialization.
Right.
Okay, so let's move past fictional characters. So I was going to ask about Ernest Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ernest Hemingway, obviously one of the great American writers, certainly I think fits the sort of solo persona in terms of lived a remarkable life.
Mm-hmm.
So he created more than he consumed. He went on these adventures. He had kind of this sort of vigorous physical life. He wasn't what you would normally think of as like the kind of weak writer, someone who wrote strong, but their personal life was sort of weak and frail. This is a man who hunted and boxed and was a hard drinker and could mix it up with the locals and so on, and had been married multiple times.
Four
times. Okay, so Ernest Hemingway married. So to me, he seems like a good candidate for someone who shouldn't have married just by virtue of getting divorced the number of times he did. That's, I think, a pretty good piece of evidence. What do you think of that?
Well, so I found this great. I think you like Hemingway because he has a white beard and he likes to work out.
He's also a man of habit.
And he likes to box.
Yeah.
And
I do like Hemingway for all those reasons.
I know.
Yeah. And less so the hunting stuff. That's
less so the hunting. I think you and Hemingway would get along well other than the drinking. He would make you feel like a little bitch. Like, he'd be like, "Do you want another one?" And you're like, "The last time I drank was 2 months ago."
Yes, it's true.
Okay, that's... Anyway, I love this quote by
I would say this. If I was with Ernest Hemingway, I would get drunk with him.
Yeah, but you'd be drunk after the second drink and you'd embarrass yourself. He'd ask you if you want a third and he wouldn't understand.
That's true.
Why you're saying no. He'd be on his 8th and you'd be on partway through your 2nd. And you'd be the same and you'd be more drunk.
It's probably number 3, I'm guessing, but yes. I have not been drinking, so yeah, I would be at a distinct disadvantage.
Okay. So Hemingway, his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, actually said, "I don't mind Ernest falling in love, but why does he always have to marry the girl when he does it?" Which, that's an interesting question. He's not living as early as Lincoln was. Hemingway died, I want to say 1961. I don't have it in front of me, but lived for mostly the first half of the 20th century. It wasn't quite the same marriage culture. It was more liberal. He wouldn't have needed to marry all these women to be with them sexually. So
But he would fall in love. He'd get wrapped up into it. He'd pull the trigger and marry them rather quickly.
He would, yeah. He was kind of a hopeless romantic for someone who's so interested in masculinity. But the interesting thing, in the course of my research, I found out that Hemingway was a sugar baby.
Oh, is that right?
That's what I like to call him because it amuses me. His first wife.
These are rich ladies.
Well, so that's a lot of his writing. I reread Snows of Kilimanjaro, which is a story about a guy who's on a big game hunting expedition in Africa, gets gangrene in his leg, and is sort of waiting to die.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of reflects on his life. And a big part of the reflection is he just married one, he would say, rich bitch after the other. It's kind of misogynistic and sort of blaming the women when he's the one who married them.
Yes.
But a lot of his writing was really about, it's kind of sad, reflecting on the fact that his first wife was really the love of his life.
This is Hemingway.
Okay. And he wished that he stayed with her, and he kept going from one wife to the next.
I see. And so these women helped support his lifestyle, so to speak.
Yeah.
Which involved travel,
big game
adventures,
hunting, watching bullfighting, doing whatever he wanted. Mm-hmm. Being able to write, being able to write without worrying about making a living, really. Mm-hmm. But this started with Hadley Richardson, his first wife. That was how this sort of habit started. And that's when I would say, after that, obviously his books were successful. During his lifetime, he was making money. But his first wife, he had nothing. He married her, and he was only able to write The Sun Also Rises, known as one of his best books, because she supported him while they were living in Paris, and he was able to write that book full time.
I see.
That's why I call him a sugar baby, and it again amuses me.
So he might not actually be a perfect candidate for someone who never married, because he did actually, one of his 4 wives was someone that he had this sort of more more evolved, not evolved is the wrong word, more modern kind of romantic connection with.
And he had a romantic connection with all of them.
But she was sort of special. But then the other one is that actually the marriage served this sort of utilitarian function for him, which is often the opposite, gendered one, which is a woman's able to, in a world where she didn't have equal opportunities, she was able to support herself in part through a marriage. He was able to support himself, at least his writing, through this marriage.
He was.
One of these marriages.
So I think...
Or some of these marriages, or all of these marriages.
I mean, I honestly saw initially the 4 wives, and the first thing I thought was, I probably shouldn't have, probably not much in common with Lincoln, but in that category, he would have been best to be solo and just date these women. But
yeah, I think the issue is, you're right, like the way to think about this is not at the time he should have been single, but if Hemingway was alive today, would he be well served remaining single?
Yeah, I think if he were alive today, he wouldn't have gotten married 4 times.
Yes.
There's just not, I don't know, I can't think of anyone who would do that today, who has done that.
Right. Okay. So that was one of the people I had thought of. Who else do you have?
And then another one that I find very interesting is likely not a name that you would know, but she was a very prominent intellectual and philosopher of really Lincoln's time period. Sort of a little later, she lived 1860 to 1935, so did a lot of her work during the late Victorian era. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And if you ever take a Victorian literature class or anything on like gender feminist studies, you'll definitely read her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. So The Yellow Wallpaper just really illustrates her whole philosophy. It's about a Victorian woman who gets married. She's married to a physician, notably. God, these Victorian physicians, they just fucked up. They're not doing anything useful. She married a physician. She has a baby. It's very clear what she has in the story is postpartum depression, but
Okay.
of course they called it nervousness, they called it hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
And her husband is sort of playing the traditional Victorian role of husband, where he is both her caretaker in kind of a condescending way and her emotional partner, but he's her doctor, so he's giving her medical advice.
Okay.
And the advice is to like stay in this room, don't do anything, sleep after each meal, don't write, don't paint, don't see anyone. And we all know the real cure for depression is to get out and do things,
To
and
move.
see people, to move.
Yeah.
So the woman in the story basically starts seeing these crazy shapes in the wallpaper. It's like this, she just keeps describing it as this lurid yellow wallpaper. And it's like first she sees the cracks slithering around, and then the cracks in the wallpaper become bars. And then she sees a figure, like a woman, crawling around and shaking the pattern on the wallpaper. So it's kind of a gothic horror story of this woman ultimately goes crazy. It's a great story, but it really mirrors her life, where she got married. She had just never been someone who I think would have wanted to have a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the postpartum depression, I mean, many people obviously want to have kids and love their kids and just experience that. But aside from that, she had a mother who was very, probably today we would call it emotionally abusive, but her father left and her mother was very like withholding of affection. And she just never had any interest in kids. She wanted to be an intellectual. She wanted to be on the lecture circuit, like we were talking about earlier, where you go to all these places and give speeches. And she did do that later in life. But she just never had much interest in kids and family life. And she got married. She had a kid. She experienced a horrible postpartum depression for unrelated reasons. Later, she actually separated from her husband, which was very rare at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Moved from the East Coast to Pasadena, California, where she worked as a writer. She was really active in these reform groups and like feminist groups. And she actually, in 1894, sent her daughter back east to live with her former husband and his second wife. And she wrote in her memoir, she was very happy for her ex-husband, since she wrote, her daughter's, quote, second mother was fully as good as the first, and perhaps better in some ways.
I see.
So she still saw her daughter later. She moved back there. She wasn't like a monster. She sort of did what would not be super uncommon for a man to do today and kind of give up custody. But for a woman in the Victorian era to willingly do that.
Yeah, it's a highly unusual.
Highly unusual. And I think it just shows that she just never wanted to have kids in the first place.
I see. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that some of this conversation, obviously, it's not just marriage per se, but it's also this idea of having children. Right. And so how much do children derail? I mean, I think what underlies this a little bit is this notion of either you're not well suited for it, personality wise, but then also you might not be well suited for it lifestyle wise. Right. So,
or you might not be well suited for it because you had a fucked up childhood.
Yeah.
And you have trauma and you can get over that and stuff. But if you have not addressed that, probably shouldn't have kids and pass on your parents' trauma onto them.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah, certainly that notion that you're just not very good at it, might be part of it too. But
that interests me. Like, this is what we were talking about earlier, where I said that people think, kind of like what I was talking about with the Lincoln thing, where this doctor says marriage is the cure. If you're sick, if you're not thriving, if you're not doing well, marriage will fix it.
Yeah.
I think people sort of think that with kids, when you're not happy, that a child will complete you or give you a greater purpose in some way. And I just think some people are wonderful parents and some people are not cut out for it. Like if I went into sales, I like to use kind of a career comparison.
Okay.
And I'm introverted and I'm nervous and I don't like talking to people and I don't have a passion for what I'm selling. People wouldn't say, just keep doing it until you get good at it. Just keep doing it. They would say, maybe you're not cut out for it. Maybe you should try a different career path. But people don't say that about kids.
Right.
they say that everyone
Should do it.
should do it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the way I was thinking about it is that some career paths, some choices that people make, or even like, not even that they make, it's a calling that they have. I think a lot of writers, for example, we're talking about a little bit about writers, have a calling, like they're just compelled to do this. And obviously some careers are so incredibly difficult that they take an overwhelming amount of time and energy and also risk that children don't really lend themselves to very much. And so you might be able to get away with having a partner, especially a partner who's willing to support you. But, and then of course, you know, the obvious thing is if you're a woman and you're doing more of the caregiving than your partner, which has been traditionally the case throughout history.
Even now,
even
when it's more equal than it's ever been in terms of the labor division of kids today, but it's still, even when men feel like it's equal, when they've done, like, you know, interviews on this, like, even when men think it's equal, the woman says, no, it's not equal.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of evidence for, it was called the second shift, that women put more effort into the shift when you get home, whether it be making meals and all the other types of support that go on. Okay. So Charlotte seems like a good one, clearly.
Yeah. Although she did, after all this drama played out, she did have a lovely marriage to her first cousin at the end of her life that she was very happy about. And she kind of talked about it oddly with all that Victorian idealized language. But she spent her whole life fighting for women's rights and that women shouldn't have to be the primary caretakers of children. And, you know, but I would say that this is a good example of someone who probably wouldn't have kids today. Yes.
All right. I have a potential one. I want to get your reaction to it. And that's Mae West.
Oh, yeah. So I have some. Well, I don't know much about her life.
Okay, that's fine.
I was looking up quotes. She's the best at. We're both interested in jokes and one-liners. She's the best at the one-liner.
She is the master of the double entendre. So, I write about her in Shtick to Business. She's really fascinating.
But did she get married?
I don't know.
We have to look this up.
I'm guessing that she did. But
damn it, Pete, we need like Rogan. We need a Jamie.
So first of all, she was like super cutting edge in terms of dealing with taboos.
She was married twice.
She's married twice. Okay.
Yeah.
So, one is like she was sort of this highly sexualized, woman. She has a lot of her jokes were double entendres about men and about sex and so on. And so one of the cool things about Mae West was she has this great quote, which is, "I love censorship. I've made a fortune because of it."
Yeah.
Because she one of the things that she did was she had this very sultry, sort of sexualized voice. Like she could say regular run-of-the-mill things and it sounded naughty, and then she found a way to avoid the censors in the FCC because she would technically not say something wrong.
Yeah, because she could just be like, apricot. And then everyone freaks out.
Yes. And so she has these like very fun kind of quotes that suggest that she's not really the marrying type.
But she did marry twice.
She did. Okay.
It's interesting.
But of course, but the fact that someone married is not good evidence.
It doesn't mean they're the marrying type.
That's right. Just because
especially when her first marriage they were married in 1914.
Right. So. There you go. Okay. So Mae West is a maybe.
Wait, this is weird. One says she was married to one dude 1911 to 1943. The other one says 1914 to 1920.
Huh. Okay, so we're going to get back to Mae West, though, because we have, at the end of this, you have a few quotes about marriage that are going to be good, right? And some of them, she has one.
She's got like 3.
Okay, she has 3. Okay, good. So we'll get back to that in a second. And so it looks like there's some...
I don't know. I truly cannot tell.
She's been married.
If she's been married. I can't tell if she's been married once or twice. It's giving me like dates that overlap with these two guys.
Okay.
But anyway, she was married. We don't know how many times.
No problem. That's not a big deal. Okay. Do you have someone else on your list?
No.
Okay.
Don Draper. We are.
So the one, my other one, and this is related to these people who would do these public talks traveling around, was Oscar Wilde. But Oscar Wilde shouldn't have gotten married because Oscar was gay.
Yes.
So
It's an obvious
that's
one.
pretty strong. It's pretty strong evidence that you probably shouldn't have got married at that time. Okay, so let's jump into these quotes.
Yeah.
I think
So there's a lot. I don't know like how many you want to do.
we can just do a few and see how it plays out. But I think like one of the fun ideas about the sort of famous quotes are it kind of tells you, it sort of takes the temperature of that time, so, of these people and so on, right? And especially because on one hand, there is this sort of view that marriage is a path to blissfulness, as a marriage is a way to cure your challenges in life and so on. And yet, when you have individuals sort of talking about this stuff, maybe they're not so positive.
Yes.
You picked humorous
And
ones?
I picked both.
Okay.
And I picked some that directly contradict.
Okay. Well, of course, I mean, that I think ends up being the case is, again, it's not that marriage is good. It's not that marriage is bad. It's good for some people. It's bad for some people. And so you would expect that to be reflected in individuals' quips about marriage.
Yes. So I find this one interesting. So this is George Bernard Shaw, the writer. This is sort of, I would say, sort of going against the Victorian ideas that were popular Lincoln's time. When two people are under the influence of the most violent, most insane, most delusive, and most transient of passions, they are required to swear that they will remain in that excited, abnormal, and exhausting condition continuously until death do them part.
I think that's first of all, that's hilarious and well said. In the following way, like it really, like, let's use Hemingway as an example of that, right? So it sounds like he truly fell in love with each of these women, and the idea is that love didn't last.
Yeah.
And
it's not crazy to fall deeply in love with 4 people over the course of your lifetime.
Sure.
But then if you expect each of them to last forever, it's kind of unrealistic.
And I don't know a lot about the research on love, but one of the things, I mean, obviously there's sort of these different forms of love, that have been documented and so on. But this idea of romantic love, this kind of quote unquote sort of soulmate-esque kind of love, that sort of butterflies in your stomach, the evidence for that is that it passes with time. Not quickly, but it does pass with time, and certainly passes before death does one part.
Although women live longer than men, so they don't have to tolerate it as long, generally.
Okay, that's a good one.
But then, so here's the counter argument.
Okay.
Because my mom is always spouting pro-marriage arguments to me, and I'm always telling her that, like, I think if I get married, I'd get divorced. I'm okay with that. But,
well, the data suggests you have a 35% chance. Actually, yours would be lower because you're highly educated.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean I make good decisions.
No, that's fair.
So that's one. But then the argument is, I think most people, if they're smart, not the people who get married at Disneyland, people who get married at Disney World, they are people who should never be getting married.
Okay.
Just point blank.
That's just a random observation you have.
But I think they would sort of subscribe to this, to that idea that the most transient of passions, that love can last forever.
Yeah.
Right. But I think a lot of people would be more realistic and think that it changes over time. So these are 2 different great thinkers who had like that same idea. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." And then the great philosopher and writer Montaigne said, if there is such a thing as a good marriage, it is because it resembles friendship rather than love.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a strong point. I mean, when I think about my longest relationships, they were often
like 2 weeks.
they were often based on a more of a kind of friendship model than a passion model. That we just got along really well, in the same way that I get along really well with my non-romantic male friends. And so it's just easy for that relationship to sort of just keep going and being good, because you share similar interests, and you share a sense of humor, and you just get along. You can just talk a lot,
right,
in that way. And so I certainly would say that for a long marriage, that notion of strong friendship.
And that was the model for a lot of history, too. I mean, the Victorian era, they got very kind of idealistic and spiritual and sentimental about it. But pretty much all through the 1700s and into the early 1800s, the model was sort of, they would say, first, you start to hold someone in esteem, like you respect someone. And then if you deeply respect someone, that love will follow. But it's the respect first and then the love. And I think today... and that all comes from rationality, really, and intellectual compatibility. And I think today, a lot of people think of love as something outside of themselves, like a force that just like hits you like a lightning bolt or something.
Now it just starts with a thirst trap. Now
it starts with sliding into the DMs.
Just a hot picture, and you're like, oh yeah. Okay, so this is one I found. This is about artists. Is it Ivan
Turgenev?
Turgenev,
yeah, the Russian writer.
It is not a good thing for an artist to marry. As the ancients used to say, if you serve a muse, you must serve her and no one else. An unhappy marriage may perhaps contribute to the development of talent, but a happy one is no good at all. We can guess what Ivan's marriage was like.
But I think that's sort of the outdated argument that artists shouldn't be happy.
No, that's fair.
That you need to be unhappy to be an artist.
I agree with that. Here's another one that I thought was this is from a book about advice to writers, so they're a little one-dimensional. The best advice on writing I ever received: don't have children. I gave it to myself.
That's my favorite one.
That's Richard Ford. That's a super fun one. Okay, do you have a Mae West one?
I have a few Mae West ones.
Okay, let's do some Mae West ones.
I think these are funny. Well, all these comedians. I've got a George Carlin one too. I am is reportedly the shortest sentence in the English language. Could it be that I do is the longest sentence?
Is that Carlin or is that Mae West?
That's George Carlin.
That's Carlin. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that it could have been Carlin or Mae West.
Yeah, it could have been either. It really could have been either. These are all kind of in the same vein. And then Mae West said, getting married is like trading in the adoration of many for the sarcasm of one. And then she said, although that could work at both ends, then you get to direct all your sarcasm on the poor bastard who buried you.
Right. I don't think she meant it that way.
I know, but that's what I think of. It's like, oh, I could really torture him if I lived with him. Mm-hmm. Could make his life, could really lower his self-esteem.
Lovely.
Then she said, men are my hobby. If I ever got married, I'd have to give it up.
Okay. Good.
And then my favorite, I think that Lincoln would have said this too. Marriage is a fine institution, but I'm not ready for an institution.
Oh, yeah. That's a fun one. I like the double entendre there.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. That's great. So well, certainly if you're listening and if you know of other people besides your parents who should never have married, please reach out to me and let me know. I can add them to the list. I think this is kind of...
Are we going to make a long list of... And they're not going to be people that anyone knows. They're just going to be like actual people in their lives.
Well, like you could just think about... you can start thinking, it's like there's like folks like Bill Clinton, right? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, a politician, you had to do it, but he didn't seem like the best kind of a married.
I don't know. I think they had a very genuine intellectual connection.
I think that's
an emotional
right.
connection. I think it's hard to have that much power. And not.
Well, it is interesting that you were saying how these sort of earlier marriages had looser standards when it came to extramarital sex.
Oh, did I talk about that already?
You
I
did.
Remember what I talked about?
Yeah, so that I think is sort of interesting, right? So
because they weren't intended to be based on love.
Yeah. So for it to work for love, you have to embrace this level of monogamy and this one person forever. But when it was done for these utilitarian purposes, for survival, to build wealth, to these things, the idea that you weren't as committed sexually, right, was a sort of a release valve of sorts, it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, and politically, for wealthier people, for anyone in government and politics, concubines were a big thing throughout history. Mistresses were much more common. Mm-hmm. Once we placed all these moral values around it, which was relatively recently.
Yeah.
Now people like Bill Clinton needed to keep it buttoned up.
Indeed. The other, and also things have also changed in terms of the reporting of this, right? It's not like, right, you think about Kennedy, was notorious for being misbehaving as president. So I think the other one isn't sort of, we can end on this note because it's sort of an open thing, which is it's that idea of marriage and children going together, and that they're almost one-to-one, throughout history, that if you got married, especially pre-birth control, you know what I mean? Like if you got married and you were having sex, there were kids that were coming.
Yeah.
And so,
I like the way you said that. It's just something about it sounds like a train coming. It's like
a freight train of children are coming. So, that idea of like, so there's sort of these sort of in between stages. Like, is it the person was not well suited to be a parent? Like what opportunities did children block for people throughout history? Especially women. That's the thing that is really striking, right? That's why birth control has been so liberating for women, because they can pursue what it is that they want to pursue when they want to pursue it. They can choose when they want to have children, if they want to have children, and so on. And so that's the first level. And then the next level is whether a partner, a so-called life partner, helps or hinders a person's lifestyle. And so in some cases they help, right? Because they can support an artist, right? The Hemingway, more, sort of patron style relationship that might exist, versus someone who really should be out and kind of traveling the world, and they're kind of locked up, and they're not totally
Charlotte
fulfilled.
Perkins Gilman.
Indeed, right.
But she became the lecturer, the public intellectual she always wanted to be.
But she had
to get out of her marriage to do it.
And she had to even forego her parenting
for
some of it. Yeah, that's right. That's really fascinating. All right, well, this was fun. I didn't know exactly what to expect, because this was sort of loosely conceptualized. At least you did your homework when it came to this.
I always do my homework.
You were very good about
I'm
this.
a teacher.
You were a teacher. So, Mary, that's great. So I'm going to put some of these things in the exhibits for people. And I'll say this again for folks. I am looking to start to build a community for Solo. So please go to the Solo podcast page at petermcgraw.org. Sign up for the mailing list. I'm going to be hosting some Zoom events, some live Zoom events where people can give some feedback about the podcast, suggest episodes, and also, most importantly, start to interact with the type of person who's being drawn and who's listening to this episode. Listening to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I think the community idea, I think that's very fun, and I'm excited to see what happens with that. And also, thank you for having me.
Welcome back. Thanks again, Mary. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org.